In the winter of 1918, HMS Intrepid limped through Pacific waters, carrying wounded from the Solomon campaigns, when fog drove them toward charts that showed only empty ocean. What the crew found was an island that belonged to no map, populated by beings that walked upright but bore no resemblance to men. The encounter lasted 3 days before the fog lifted and the island vanished, leaving only questions, scars, and testimony no admiralty would accept. So before we continue, make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Thanks. I kept the ship's log for HMS Intrepid during her final voyage, though the pages I write now will never see an official file. My name is Midshipman Thomas Hartwell, and I set down these words in a Portsmouth boarding house, where no one asks why a man drinks alone or why his hands shake when the fog rolls in from the harbor. The Intrepid was a light cruiser, built for speed and reconnaissance. But in November of 1918, she carried a cargo that slowed her considerably. 43 wounded sailors from the action at Bougainville lay in hammocks strung between the guns, men with shattered limbs and hollow eyes who had seen too much of war's work. We had medical supplies, morphine, and a surgeon named Crawford, whose beard had gone gray in the 4 years since Jutland. Our orders were simple: make Brisbane with all speed and transfer the wounded to proper hospital care. Captain Morrison was a steady man who had brought 3 ships safely through the war. He stood medium height with careful eyes and hands that never hurried on the bridge. First Officer Blackwood managed the crew with a quiet authority that came from 15 years before the mast. Chief Petty Officer Mills knew every rivet and steam pipe aboard, and Boatswain Hayes could splice line in a gale. We were a reduced crew of 38, running a ship meant for 60, but we were experienced men who knew their business. The trouble began on the second day out from Guadalcanal. A bank of fog rose from the southwest, thick and gray, with an odd quality to the light inside it. The barometer held steady, but the sea took on a glassy calm that made no sense with the wind still fresh. Morrison ordered a course change to skirt the fog bank, but it spread faster than we could turn. Within an hour, we were wrapped in gray that pressed close to the bridge windows and muffled the sound of our engines. The fog held a smell I had not encountered before. Not salt and kelp, but something dry and sharp, like heated stone. It carried voices too, or sounds that might have been voices if heard from a great distance. Hayes swore he heard singing in a language he did not recognize. Mills reported that the engine room temperature had risen 10 degrees without cause. The wounded men grew restless in their hammocks, calling out in their sleep. We ran blind for 6 hours. The compass needle swung in lazy circles. The chronometer ticked, but the sun gave no bearing through the gray. Morrison ordered reduced speed and posted extra lookouts, though they could see no farther than the length of a boat hook. The sea remained flat, disturbed only by our own wake, which seemed to spread wider than physics allowed and linger longer than water should remember. Near dusk, or what we guessed was dusk by the chronometer, Seaman Roberts called from the bow, "Land ahead, sir, 2 points off the starboard bow." Morrison joined me at the forward rail. Through the fog, a dark mass rose from the water. It showed steep cliffs and a fringe of vegetation, but no lights, no smoke, no sign of habitation. The charts for this position showed deep ocean for 300 miles in any direction. Morrison ordered all stop. The engines wound down, and the ship settled into an eerie quiet. We could hear waves lapping against the stone, but the sound seemed to come from the wrong direction. The fog thinned enough to show us a narrow bay with black sand beaches and water that reflected no light from our lamps. "Take a sounding," Morrison said. Mills dropped a lead line and called back 12 fathoms, good holding ground. The island rose from the water in terraces of dark rock, each level thick with trees that looked wrong even in the dim light. The trunks grew too straight, and the leaves hung in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. No birds flew among them. No insects hummed in the warm air that drifted from shore. We dropped anchor and held council on the bridge. Morrison spread his charts and measured our position 3 times. By dead reckoning, we should be in open water, 800 miles from the nearest land. Blackwood suggested we had been pushed off course by an unknown current, but the compass had shown steady bearing even as the needle spun. Crawford reported that the wounded men had grown quiet, all of them sleeping deeper than morphine alone could account for. "We investigate at first light," Morrison decided. "A small party to take bearings and fresh water if we can find it. We do not linger." He did not say what we all felt, that this place carried a wrongness that went deeper than navigational error. I drew first watch that night. The fog had settled to a thin layer that clung to the water but left the island clear. In the light of a half-moon, I could see structures on the terraced levels. Not buildings as I understood them, but arrangements of stone that followed curves instead of angles. They seemed to shift when I was not looking directly at them, like heat shimmer, but the night was cool. Around midnight, lights appeared among the structures. Not fires, but a cold glow that pulsed in slow rhythm. The lights moved in patterns that suggested purpose, gathering in clusters and then spreading apart. Sometimes they descended toward the shore, and then withdrew. I called Blackwood to the bridge. He studied the lights through binoculars and handed them back without comment. "Note it in the log," he said. "Native settlement, extent unknown." He did not meet my eyes when he said it. The lights continued until dawn. As the sun rose, they faded, and the island looked empty again. But in the growing light, I could see paths worn into the cliff face, too wide for human feet, and cut at angles that followed no logic of switchback or grade. Something lived on this island, and it had shaped the stone to its own needs. Morrison led the shore party himself. 6 men in the whaler, armed with rifles and cutlasses, carrying water casks and survey gear. I took the logbook and sketching materials. Hayes brought rope and tools for climbing. Seaman Kelly carried the medical bag in case we found other castaways. The island drew us despite every instinct that said we should weigh anchor and steam away. The black sand crunched under our boots with a sound like broken glass. The beach stretched in a perfect arc, unmarked by debris or seaweed. The high tide line showed a layer of shells, but they were not like any I had seen in 20 years of sailing. They were too regular, too smooth, as if shaped by hands rather than worn by waves. We found the first track 20 yards inland, pressed deep into clay that had dried to the hardness of pottery. The print was human in general shape, but wrong in every detail. The toes were too long and ended in points. The arch was too high. The heel showed a ridge down the center like a keel. The stride was longer than any man could manage, even running. Morrison measured the track with his pace and made a note in the margin of my sketches. "Large native," he said, "barefoot, accustomed to rough ground." He spoke as if saying it would make it true, but his voice carried less conviction than his words. The path led inland through trees that grew in spirals, their bark scored with marks that might have been writing or decoration. The marks appeared fresh, cut deep enough to weep sap, but the cuts showed no tool marks. They looked as if they had been made with claws, but claws that could work with purpose and planning. We climbed the first terrace by a ramp of fitted stones. The work was ancient but solid, each block placed without mortar, yet holding tight. The ramp rose at an angle that favored longer legs than ours. We had to take high steps that strained our knees and left us winded at the top. The first terrace held structures that defied quick understanding. Low buildings with doorways too narrow for a man's shoulders, but tall enough that we had to duck our heads. Rooms with floors that sloped toward drains, cut in geometric patterns. Wells that descended beyond the reach of our rope, but gave back no echo when we dropped stones. Kelly found the first carving near a circular pool filled with water that looked black in the sunlight. The stone showed figures in procession, upright and human in outline, but wrong in proportion and detail. The heads were too narrow. The arms were too thin. The hands ended in fingers that were too long and jointed in too many places. They carried objects that might have been tools, or weapons, or ceremonial implements, but the function of each was unclear. "Natives with a talent for stonework," Morrison said, but he did not approach the pool. The water remained still despite a breeze that stirred the trees around us. No insects landed on its surface. No reflection showed in its depths. We pressed on to the second terrace. The buildings here were larger and more complex, with chambers that connected in networks, too elaborate for simple dwellings. Corridors led to stairs that climbed into walls. Rooms opened onto other rooms with no apparent purpose. Everything was built to a scale that accommodated beings taller and narrower than men. Hayes found the first skeleton in a chamber that might have been a workshop. The bones lay scattered, not from violence, but from age and weather. The skull was human in general shape, but elongated, with eye sockets set too far apart and a jaw that protruded too far forward. The spine showed extra vertebrae. The ribs were narrow and numerous. The finger bones were thin as quills and jointed in places where human fingers showed only smooth bone. Morrison studied the skeleton from a distance and ordered us to leave it undisturbed. "Deformed native," he said, "birth defect or disease." But the bones showed no sign of pathology, only a structure that followed different rules of anatomy. We found more skeletons as we climbed. Some were complete, laid out in poses that suggested ceremony. Others were scattered, as if abandoned in haste. All showed the same elongated proportions and extra joints. The bone was harder than a human bone and had a green cast in certain light. Some skulls showed holes drilled with precision that spoke of surgery or ritual, but the holes were too large and too numerous for any medical purpose I could name. On the third terrace, we found them alive. The building was larger than the others, with a central chamber that rose to a dome of fitted stone. Light entered through openings cut in patterns that threw moving shadows across the floor. The walls held carvings that covered every surface, figures and symbols and scenes that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. They stood in a circle around a pool of water that glowed with the same cold light we had seen from the ship. 7 figures, tall and thin, with skin that showed green highlights in the strange illumination. They wore no clothing, but their skin was marked with patterns that might have been tattoos or natural coloration. Their heads were narrow and elongated, with large eyes that reflected light like a cat's. Their mouths were wide and filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. They did not move when we entered. They did not speak. They simply watched us with those reflecting eyes, turning their heads with movements too fluid for human necks. The silence stretched until my ears rang with it. Morrison raised his hand in what he hoped was a gesture of peace. One of the figures tilted its head and made a sound that was not quite a hiss and not quite speech. The sound echoed from the walls and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Kelly stepped backward and his boots scraped stone. The sound broke the spell. All 7 figures turned toward him with movements too quick and too synchronized. Their eyes fixed on him, and he froze like a rabbit under a hawk's gaze. "Back away slowly," Morrison whispered. "No sudden movements." We began to withdraw, but the figures followed, not walking but gliding across the stone floor with steps that made no sound. They maintained their distance, but matched our pace exactly, herding us towards the entrance without touching us or speaking. Once outside, they stopped at the threshold and watched us descend the ramp. Their eyes caught the sunlight and threw it back in flashes of green and gold. Only when we reached the second terrace did they withdraw into the shadows of their building. "Natives," Morrison said again, but his voice shook. "Island tribe. Isolated population." Hayes spat in the dust and checked his rifle. "Never seen natives like those, sir. Not in 20 years of Pacific service." We returned to the beach without further encounter, but I felt eyes on us from every shadow. The trees seemed to whisper as we passed. The carved stones appeared to move when glimpsed from the corner of an eye. The island watched us leave with an attention that pressed against my shoulders like a physical weight. Back aboard the Intrepid, Morrison ordered steam raised and the anchor weighed. But when we tried to leave the bay, the engines labored as if fighting a strong current. The water around the ship began to glow with the same cold light we had seen in the building. Fish rose to the surface, but they were not fish as any sailor would recognize. They had too many fins and eyes that glowed like coals. Some showed faces that were almost human, but stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Crawford reported that the wounded men had begun to speak in their sleep, all of them using the same words in a language none of us recognized. The words were harsh and angular, full of sounds that human throats should not be able to make. When he tried to wake them, their eyes showed the same reflective quality we had seen in the island dwellers. We fought the current for 6 hours, making no headway despite full steam. The fuel gauges dropped toward empty. The engine room temperature continued to rise. Mills reported that the bearings were running hot and the boiler pressure was falling despite constant firing. As night fell, the lights on the island grew brighter and began to descend toward the shore. We could see figures moving along the cliff paths, tall shapes that flowed like water over the rough stone. The water around the ship glowed brighter, and the strange fish swam in spirals that tightened with each revolution. "Signal lamp," Morrison ordered. "Try to establish communication." Blackwood worked the shutters in a standard greeting pattern. The lights on shore pulsed in response, but not in any code we recognized. The pattern was complex and rhythmic, like music made of light. As it continued, the wounded men below deck began to moan in unison, their voices rising and falling with the pulse of the island lights. "Cut the signal," Morrison said. "Whatever they're doing to our men, we're helping them do it." The moment Blackwood closed the shutters, the lights on shore went out. The water around us darkened. The wounded men fell silent. But the current that held us in place grew stronger, and now we could hear singing from the shore, voices that rose and fell in harmonies too complex for human throats. I stood watch again that night, but I was not alone on deck. The wounded men had begun to rise from their hammocks and gather at the rails. They moved despite injuries that should have kept them immobile. Broken legs carried weight without pain. Shattered arms moved freely. But their eyes reflected the moonlight, and their faces showed no expression I could read. Crawford tried to lead them back to their berths, but they pushed him aside with strength that belonged to healthy men. They lined the rails and stared at the island, swaying slightly as if hearing music that carried no melody for the rest of us. "They're changing," Crawford whispered. "Whatever those things did to them, it's changing them." I looked closer at the wounded men and saw he was right. Their proportions seemed different. Their necks appeared longer. Their fingers showed extra joints that had not been there before. When they breathed, their chests expanded too far, and their ribs showed through their skin like the bars of a cage. Near dawn, the fog began to lift. The current that held us weakened, and then released us entirely. The engines caught their rhythm again, and the ship answered her helm. Morrison ordered full speed ahead, steering for open ocean by dead reckoning and hope. As we pulled away from the island, the wounded men collapsed as one, falling to the deck like marionettes with cut strings. Crawford and his mates carried them below, but their bodies had returned to their original proportions. The extra joints were gone. The elongated necks had shortened. Whatever had been changing them had withdrawn when we left the island's influence. By full daylight, we were in clear water under a blue sky. The fog had vanished completely, and the island was nowhere to be seen. Morrison took star sights and found we were exactly where our charts said we should be, 800 miles from the nearest land. The compass needle pointed true north and stayed there. We made Brisbane 2 days later and transferred the wounded to hospital care. The doctors found their injuries healing at rates that defied medical understanding. Broken bones had mended cleanly. Deep wounds had closed without scarring. Men who had been dying were walking within a week. Morrison filed a report that mentioned engine trouble and navigational difficulties due to fog. He made no mention of the island or its inhabitants. When the Admiralty asked for details, he said the fog had been too thick for reliable observations, and the compass malfunction had prevented accurate position plotting. The wounded men remembered nothing of the voyage after leaving Guadalcanal. They recalled boarding the Intrepid and then waking in Brisbane Hospital with their injuries healed. When questioned about their recovery, they spoke of dreams involving green lights and singing voices, but they could recall no details that made sense to medical personnel. I submitted my own report 3 times, complete with sketches of the island and its inhabitants. Each time, it was returned with a note that clerical errors had been found and a corrected version should be resubmitted. The fourth time, I was informed that no report was needed from junior personnel regarding routine medical transport duties. Hayes died in a Portsmouth pub 3 months later, found at a table with his hands around a glass and his eyes wide open. The doctor said his heart had stopped, but Hayes was only 35 and had been healthy all his life. The landlord said he had been talking about green lights and singing voices just before he died. Kelly transferred to shore duty and worked in supply until his discharge. He would not speak of the voyage, even when pressed. When other sailors asked about his time aboard the Intrepid, he would look at his hands and say the ship had been decommissioned and the records sealed. Blackwood took early retirement and bought a cottage in Devon where he grows vegetables and avoids the sea. I wrote to him once, asking if he remembered the island. His reply was brief. Some things are better left in the fog where they belong. Morrison received promotion to Commodore and command of a training squadron based in Portsmouth. He never took another ship to sea. When I encountered him at a naval reception years later, he looked through me as if I were a stranger. But I saw his hands shake when thunder rolled in from the channel, and I noticed he avoided windows that faced the water. The Intrepid was decommissioned 6 months after our return. She was towed to a breaker's yard and cut up for scrap with unusual haste. The official reason was structural damage from combat operations, but sailors who worked the yard said she was sound as a bell when they took her apart. They said she went to the torches too quickly, as if someone wanted her gone and forgotten. I kept my sketches and notes, despite repeated requests, to surrender them for official review. The drawings show the island clearly, with its terraced levels and spiral trees and the strange buildings that seemed to bend light around their corners. The notes record temperatures and compass bearings and the exact words the wounded men spoke in their alien sleep. But I have never shown them to anyone who might believe what they represented. The war is over, and the world has moved on to new concerns. There is no place in this modern age for islands that exist outside the charts, or beings that change men with their touch. Such things belong to the realm of folklore and sailors' tales, not to official reports and admiralty files. Yet sometimes, when fog rolls in from the sea, and the light takes on that peculiar quality I remember from the Pacific, I wonder about the wounded men we carried. They healed too well and too quickly. They forgot too cleanly. And sometimes, in the narrow streets of Portsmouth, where the fog clings longest, I see faces in the crowd that are too thin and too pale, with eyes that reflect light like still water, and voices that carry harmonies no human throat should manage. The island may have vanished when the fog lifted, but I think what we brought back with us remained, spreading slowly through the wounded men and into the world beyond. We thought we had escaped that place and its inhabitants, but perhaps we had simply become the means by which they could finally leave. I write this account knowing it will be dismissed as the fantasy of an old sailor whose mind has been touched by too many years at sea. But I set it down complete and true, with every detail I can recall, because someone should know what we found in that fog and what we may have brought back with us. The charts still show empty ocean where we found the island. But the ocean is vast, and the fog is always waiting, and somewhere in the spaces between the known and the mapped, that place endures. It watches the shipping lanes and waits for the next vessel to lose its way in the gray. And when the fog lifts and the ship escapes, it counts what it has planted in the cargo and the crew, knowing that the seeds will grow in their own time and in their own way. I sleep poorly now when the weather turns thick. I listen to the fog horns in the harbor and wonder if they are warnings or signals. And sometimes, when the sound carries just right across the water, I think I hear singing in harmonies, too complex for human voices, calling from somewhere beyond the edge of every map.